The rain had not yet come, but Lynette Hale could feel it gathering the way she always felt bad news before it arrived. A tightness behind the ribs, a hush in the air that had nothing to do with weather. She stood at the window of Bramblewood's shabby morning room, watching the drive for a carriage that had not yet appeared, and told herself, for perhaps the 100th time that week, that she was not afraid. She was lying, of course. She had become rather good at it. In 3 days, she was to be married to a man she had never met. In 3 days, she would become the Duchess of Rothermere, mistress of a house larger than the entire village she had grown up in, wife to a man whom half of London called the Ice Duke, and whispered of in tones that made even hardened matrons lower their voices. They said he had broken his last betrothed so cruelly that the poor girl had fled to the continent rather than face society again. They said he did not smile. They said he collected debts the way other men collected snuff boxes, and that her aunt's arrangement of this marriage had less to do with Lynette's happiness than with the very convenient erasure of the debt her late father had left behind. That last part, at least, was true. Lynette had seen the papers herself, smuggled a look at them one evening when her aunt had gone to bed early with a headache and a glass of ratafia. £6,000. Her father had been a foolish, loving, hopeless man, and he had left his only child to pay for his hopefulness with the whole of her future. "You will not scowl at the wallpaper, Lynette," said her aunt now, sweeping into the room in a rustle of grey silk. Mrs. Prudence Yardley had never been an affectionate woman, but marriage to Lynette's late uncle had made her a practical one, and practicality, in Mrs. Yardley's experience, always required a woman to be pleasant, regardless of her feelings. "The Duke's man will be here within the hour to collect you, and I will not have it said that my niece greeted her betrothed's household looking as though she were bound for the gallows." "I am not scowling," Lynette said. "I am thinking. Thinking is worse. Men do not like women who think, not before the wedding at any rate." Mrs. Yardley adjusted a pin in her own hair with the brisk efficiency of a woman closing an account book. "You are fortunate, Lynette. Whatever you believe, the Duke of Rothermere could have any woman in England. That he has agreed to take a girl with £6,000 of debt attached to her like a millstone is nothing short of a miracle, and I will thank you to behave as though you understand that." Lynette did understand it. She understood it perfectly. She understood that she was, in the coldest and most arithmetic sense, a transaction, a debt exchanged for a title, a name traded for a name, with her own preferences weighing on the scale about as much as a feather weighs against a horseshoe. She had understood it for 6 months, ever since the letters had begun arriving from Rothermere's solicitor, each one colder and more precise than the last, each one referring to her not as Lynette, but as the intended party, as though she were a parcel of land rather than a person with a heartbeat. She had asked her aunt once what the Duke was like. Mrs. Yardley had said only, "wealthy," as if that answered the question, which, as far as Mrs. Yardley was concerned, it entirely did. But Lynette had heard other things, in the sideways manner that unmarried young women hear things, from the vicar's wife, and from a cousin twice removed, who had once attended a ball at Rothermere Hall. She had heard that the Duke did not dance, that he had once dismissed an entire wing of servants for a single dropped tray, that his last betrothed, the celebrated beauty Lady Camilla Vexley, had broken the engagement herself rather than endure another season of his coldness, though other accounts insisted it was he who had cast her off, publicly and without mercy, over some slight so small no one could quite agree on what it had been. 2 stories, opposite in every particular, and both of them painting the same portrait. A man without warmth, without patience, without the smallest inclination toward tenderness. Lynette had spent the last 3 nights lying awake, trying to imagine her wedding night to such a man, and had given up each time, somewhere around midnight, cold with dread. "He is sending his own coachman for you," Mrs. Yardley said now, checking the mantel clock with the air of a general reviewing troop movements. "A mark of consideration, I am told, rather than a hired chaise. You are to travel to Rothermere directly. The Duke does not care to waste time on unnecessary formalities before the wedding, and frankly, Lynette, neither do I. The sooner you are married, the sooner this family's affairs are in order. You make it sound as though I am being shipped, Aunt, like a crate of china. China is valuable and easily broken. I should think the comparison flatters you. Mrs. Yardley did not smile, but something in her face softened by the barest fraction, the closest she ever came to affection. Wear the blue pelisse. It is the only one of your gowns that does not look as though it was made for a woman 10 years dead. And for heaven's sake, Lynette, try to be agreeable to the coachman at least. Servants talk, and I should not like the first report to reach Rothermere Hall be that his bride cannot manage common civility. It was, Lynette would later think, the single piece of advice her aunt had ever given her that mattered. The carriage arrived at 2:30, drawn by a pair of dark bays, so well matched and so beautifully groomed that Lynette's breath caught at the sight of them before she had even seen the man who drove them. It was, she thought, exactly the sort of ostentation she had expected from a duke. Magnificent horses, gleaming black lacquer, the Rothermere crest picked out in gold upon the door, a stag rampant beneath a coronet, fierce and cold as its owner was rumoured to be. But the coachman himself surprised her. He was an old man, 70 at the least, she guessed, perhaps older, with a face weathered brown as a walnut, and a great quantity of white hair, escaping from beneath a low, plain hat. He wore no livery grander than a coachman's coat, patched neatly at one elbow, and he climbed down from the box with the careful, deliberate movements of a man whose joints had begun, some years past, to charge interest on every bend and stretch. There was nothing of the Duke's supposed coldness in him. His eyes, when he looked up at her from beneath heavy white brows, were a startling clear grey, sharp with an intelligence that seemed almost out of place in a servant of his years, and there was something in the set of his mouth that suggested he found the world, on the whole, quietly amusing. "Miss Hale, is it?" he said, and his voice was low and pleasant, roughened by age but not by unkindness. "Godwin, miss, at your service. I'm to see you safe to Rothermere Hall. Mr. Godwin?" Lynette inclined her head, and, because her aunt's parting words were still ringing in her ears, and because there was something in the old man's face that made her want, quite badly, to be kind to him, she offered her hand, an act of such unusual familiarity toward a servant that the man blinked at it for a moment before taking it in his own weathered fingers with old-fashioned gravity. "You are very good to come so far for me," Lynette said. "It is a long journey from Rothermere, is it not? You must be tired already, and we have not even begun." "I've made worse journeys for less worthy cargo, miss, if you'll forgive the word," Godwin said, and there was a warmth in it that startled her further. Most coachmen she had known, and she had known a fair number, in her family's diminished circumstances, mostly hired men with weary faces and no patience for conversation, treated their passengers as burdens to be delivered and forgotten. This one looked at her as though she were, in some way she could not name, a matter of genuine interest to him. "I am afraid I shall be rather dull company for such a long road," she said, as he handed her up into the carriage, with a steadiness that belied his years. "I have a great deal on my mind." "Most brides do, in my experience, miss. Might I ask what troubles you, if it isn't too forward of an old man to inquire?" It was forward. It was entirely improper. A well-bred young lady did not confide her fears to her betrothed's coachman on the very first mile of the journey to her wedding. But there was something about Godwin's face, the patient, unhurried kindness of it, the sense that he had all the time in the world and no particular urgency to judge her, that loosened something in Lynette's chest that had been knotted tight for months. "I am to marry a man I have never met," she said, as the carriage lurched into motion and the hedgerows of bramblewood began to slide past the window. "A man everyone tells me is cold, and cruel to those who displease him, and incapable of the smallest tenderness. I am marrying him because my father left debts he could not pay, and because my aunt has arranged it as one arranges the sale of a horse, and because I have no choice in the matter whatsoever. So forgive me, Mr. Godwin, if I am not the picture of a joyful bride." She had not meant to say so much. The words had simply come, unbidden, the way water finds the lowest point in a field. For a long moment, Godwin said nothing at all, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, his weathered hands steady on the reins. When he spoke again, his voice had changed in some subtle way she could not quite name, grown quieter, more careful. "And what have you heard, miss, of the Duke himself? Not of his fortune, nor his houses. Of the man. That he does not smile, that he dismissed an entire wing of servants over a dropped tray, that his last betrothed fled the country to escape him." Linnet looked out the window rather than at the old man's face, unwilling to see whatever judgment might be written there. That he is, in short, precisely the sort of husband a woman prays never to have, and precisely the sort my aunt was delighted to secure, because a man with no heart asks no awkward questions about a bride's empty purse. "That is a great deal to know of a man you have never met," Godwin said, mildly. "It is a great deal to be told by everyone who has met him. Gossip, miss, is a coin that gains value with every hand it passes through, and loses truth in precisely the same measure." He glanced sideways at her then, and something flickered in those clear grey eyes, something that might, in a younger man, have been called wounded. "I have served the house of Rothermere the whole of my life, miss, since before the present Duke was born. I knew his father, and I have known him since he was a boy small enough to ride upon my knee. I will not pretend he is an easy man. Grief has made him guarded, and betrayal has made him wary, and I do not doubt he has given the world ample reason to think ill of him these last 2 years. But cold, miss." He shook his head slowly. "Cold is not the word I would choose." "Then what word would you choose?" Linnet asked, curious despite herself. Godwin was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the road, his jaw working as though he were turning the question over like a stone in his palm. "Careful," he said at last. "I would call him careful, Miss Hale. A man who has been burned does not stop feeling the fire's heat merely because he has learned to keep his hands from it." It was, Linnet would think later, an extraordinarily perceptive thing for a coachman to say, the sort of observation that belonged more properly to a philosopher than to a man who spent his days upon a driving box. But she thought little of it at the time, distracted as she was by her own dread, and the carriage rolled on through the lengthening afternoon, while the sky above them darkened by degrees, gathering itself toward the storm that had been threatening all morning. They had gone perhaps 15 miles when the rain began, not gently, but all at once, a great grey curtain of it that turned the road to soup within a quarter of an hour and sent the horses skittering nervously against their harness. Linnet heard Godwin's voice through the carriage wall, low and soothing, gentling the animals with the ease of long practice, and she thought, with a small unexpected pang, that whatever else might be said of the Duke of Rothermere, he had at least kept a good man in his service, one who spoke to frightened horses with more patience than most gentlemen spoke to their own wives. It was perhaps 20 minutes later, as the light was failing and the rain showed no sign of relenting, that the carriage lurched violently and came to a shuddering, uneven halt. Linnet was thrown against the seat cushions, catching herself with both hands, her heart hammering. Through the rain-streaked window she could see very little beyond grey sheets of water and the vague dark shapes of trees, but she could hear Godwin's voice, sharper now, calling something to the horses, and beneath it, beneath the horses' unhappy shifting and the drum of rain on the carriage roof, the unmistakable, sickening crack of wood giving way. She did not wait to be handed down. She pushed open the door herself, ignoring the rain that struck her instantly like a slap, and found Godwin crouched beside the rear wheel, his coat already soaked through, his white hair plastered flat against his skull. "The axle, miss," he said, without looking up. "Cracked clean through, I'm afraid. We'll go no further tonight in this carriage. Are you hurt?" It was the first question that came to her, ahead of any thought for her own comfort or the ruin of her blue pelisse, and she saw something shift in the old man's face when she asked it, a flicker of surprise, quickly suppressed. "No, miss. Only wet, and vexed with myself for not having the wheel checked before we left. You could not have known an axle would crack, Mr. Godwin. That is hardly a fault to lay at your own door. She looked about them at the darkening, rain-soaked lane, empty in both directions as far as she could see. What is to be done? There is an inn, miss, not 2 miles distant. The Heart and Crown, if memory serves. I passed it not an hour since. Godwin straightened slowly, wincing as he did so, one hand pressed briefly to the small of his back, in a manner Lynette suspected he thought she had not seen. I'll see to the horses, and walk ahead, to send help back for the carriage. If you'll shelter beneath the trees there, miss, out of the worst of the wet, you will do no such thing, Lynette said, with a firmness that surprised them both. You are an old man in soaking clothes, proposing to walk 2 miles in a storm, while I sit dry beneath a tree, like a fine lady in a painting. We will walk together, Mr. Godwin, or not at all. Miss Hale, it would hardly be fitting. Fitting can wait until we are both dry, and neither of us has caught our death, Lynette said, and there was something in her voice, some flare of the same stubbornness that had, 6 months ago, made her argue uselessly with her aunt's solicitor for a full hour before accepting the inevitable, that made the old coachman look at her for a long moment with an expression she could not read at all, something caught between astonishment and a strange, aching tenderness. You are a most unusual young lady, he said quietly. I have been told I am a great many unflattering things this week, Mr. Godwin. Unusual is, I think, the kindest of them. They walked the 2 miles together in the driving rain, Lynette's fine blue pelisse ruined beyond any hope of repair, her half-boots filling with cold water at every step, and yet she found, to her own surprise, that she did not mind it nearly so much as she ought to have. There was something almost freeing in the misery of it, in the shared, absurd indignity of 2 people slogging through mud in the failing light, laughing, more than once, at the sheer wretchedness of their circumstances. Godwin told her stories as they walked, of the Rothermere stables, and the horses he had trained there across half a century, of a boyhood spent in a village not unlike her own, of a wife long dead, whom he still spoke of, with a tenderness that made Lynette's throat tighten unexpectedly. "Do you not find it lonely?" she asked him, "in service to a man they say has no heart?" Godwin was quiet for a long moment, his grey eyes fixed on the rain-blurred road ahead. "I have never found him without a heart, miss," he said at last, "only without an audience willing to believe he had one. There is a difference, though the world rarely troubles itself to notice it." She thought about that for the rest of the walk, turning it over the way one turns over a coin whose value one cannot quite determine, and by the time the lights of the Heart and Crown came into view, small and gold and impossibly welcoming through the grey wash of rain, something in Lynette's chest had shifted, not resolved, not settled, but shifted, the way a stone shifts in a riverbed, changing the whole course of the water around it without anyone quite seeing it move. The innkeeper, a broad red-faced man named Purdy, took one look at their sodden state and hurried them both toward the fire with a great deal of clucking sympathy, though Lynette noticed, with a small private frown, that his attention settled far more readily upon her than upon the old coachman beside her, as though Godwin were furniture to be stepped around, rather than a man half drowned in the same storm. "A room for the lady, of course, Purdy fussed, "and dry things sent up directly, but the old fellow can wait by the kitchen fire well enough, I dare say. No need to trouble the good rooms for a servant. He will have a room, and a fire, and dry clothes, exactly as I am to have them," Lynette said, in a voice that brooked no argument, surprising herself with its steel. "He has walked 2 miles in this storm for my sake, Mr. Purdy, and I will not have him treated as though his comfort matters less than mine, simply because he wears a coachman's coat rather than a gentleman's." Purdy blinked at her, clearly unused to being addressed in such terms by a young lady of evidently modest means, but something in Lynette's face brooked no further argument, and he bustled off, muttering, to see it done. Godwin, standing dripping by the fire, looked at her with an expression she would remember for a very long time afterward, grave, searching, almost startled, as though she had done something far more remarkable than insist upon ordinary decency. "You did not need to do that, miss," he said quietly. I rather think I did, Lynette said. I have spent my whole life being told that my worth is measured by what I can offer others. My father's debts, my aunt's convenience, now a duke's convenience besides. I know something of what it is to be treated as though one's comfort does not signify. I will not stand by and watch it done to another person, while it is within my power to prevent it. Something moved across the old man's face then, something that looked, for just a moment, very much like grief, though for what or whom Lynette could not begin to guess. He said nothing more, only bowed his head to her with a formality that seemed, somehow, too deep for a coachman's simple courtesy, and allowed himself to be led away to a fire and dry clothes of his own. It was over a simple supper that evening, for the Duke's men had been sent for and would not arrive with a fresh carriage until morning, and there was nothing for it but to wait out the night at the Heart and Crown, that Lynette found herself, for the second time that day, telling Godwin far more than she had ever intended to tell anyone. She told him of her father, dead these 2 years, whose gentle foolishness she had loved even as it ruined them both. She told him of her mother, dead longer still, of whom she remembered mostly the smell of lavender and a voice singing something half forgotten in the dark. She told him, in a rush she could not quite account for, of her fear, not merely of marrying a stranger, though that fear was real enough, but of marrying a man who would look at her the way her aunt looked at her, as an entry in a ledger to be balanced rather than a person to be known. I do not ask for love, she said, staring into the fire rather than at the old man across from her. I know better than to ask for that, but I had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that I might at least be seen, that whoever I married might trouble himself to learn who I am, rather than simply what I am worth to him. Is that so very much to want, Mr. Godwin? No, Godwin said, and his voice had gone rough in a way that had nothing to do with age. It is not too much to want at all, Miss Hale. I think it is, in fact, the least any person ought to ask of another. He was quiet after that for a long while, watching the fire with an expression of such deep and private feeling that Lynette found herself curious, despite the lateness of the hour and the weariness in her bones. You speak of him with such loyalty, she said at last. The Duke, I mean, and yet you do not deny the things they say of him. I do not deny that he has given the world cause to say them, Godwin said carefully. 2 years ago, he was engaged to a woman he believed he loved. She was beautiful and clever and utterly without a heart beneath the beauty. And he did not see it, because he did not wish to see it, until the night he discovered her striking a housemaid across the face for the crime of spilling a single drop of wine upon her gown. He paused, his jaw tight. He ended the engagement within the hour. She told the world he had cast her off out of cruelty and caprice, and because she was clever and he was proud, and neither of them cared to correct the story with the truth. The world believed her. He has worn the name Ice Duke ever since, and said nothing to unmake it, because he had rather be thought cold than be thought a fool who loved a woman capable of such cruelty. Lynette sat very still, the fire crackling between them, something in her chest aching in a way she did not fully understand. That is a very sad story, she said quietly. It is a very common one, miss, dressed up in a duke's coat. Pride does more damage to good men than villainy ever could, in my long experience of the world. Godwin looked at her then, and his clear grey eyes held hers with an intensity that seemed, for one strange and fleeting moment, entirely wrong for a servant addressing his employer's betrothed. I do not say this to excuse whatever coldness he may yet show you, Miss Hale, only to ask that you withhold your final judgment until you have met the man himself, rather than the shadow the gossips have made of him. I begin to think, Lynette said slowly, that you are a remarkable coachman, Mr. Godwin. I have never met a servant who spoke so eloquently, nor with such evident feeling, of his master's private sorrows. Something flickered across the old man's weathered face, alarm, quickly hidden, or so it seemed to her in the uncertain firelight, and he looked away toward the window, where the rain had at last begun to slacken. I have served this family the whole of my life, miss, he said after a moment. It would be a poor sort of loyalty that felt nothing at all. They spoke no more of the Duke that night. Lynette retired to her small chamber above the tap-room, with her thoughts in greater disorder than they had been even that morning, and lay awake a long while listening to the last of the rain against the window, turning over in her mind the strange, sad story of a proud man wronged, and finding, to her own considerable surprise, that some small, stubborn part of her heart had begun, quite against her will, to hope. She did not know, as she drifted at last into sleep, that in the next chamber, the man she called Godwin sat awake a good deal longer than she did, his weathered disguise laid carefully aside upon a chair, his own face, a face far younger than 70 years, though careworn enough to have earned every one of the grey hairs that were, in truth, entirely his own, turned toward the same rain-streaked window, his thoughts every bit as disordered as hers. Julian Ashworth, 6th Duke of Rothermere, had not meant to deceive her quite so thoroughly, nor for quite so long. He had meant only to observe her, to see, before he bound himself irrevocably to a stranger, whether the girl his solicitors had selected to settle a convenient debt was capable of the ordinary human decency that Camilla Vexley had so spectacularly lacked. It had seemed, when he first proposed the scheme to his old and genuinely retired coachman, the real Godwin, laid up at present with a troublesome hip, and only too delighted to lend his name and his coat to his master's peculiar plan, a simple enough test. He would drive her himself, disguised in age and shabby wool, and see how she treated a man she believed beneath her notice. He had not expected an axle to crack in a storm. He had not expected to walk 2 miles beside her through freezing rain, listening to her order an innkeeper to give an old coachman a fire and dry clothes, with the same fierce dignity she might have used to defend her own honor. He had not expected her to ask, before anything else, whether he was hurt. He had certainly not expected to find himself, an hour past midnight, lying awake in a strange inn, with his heart behaving in a manner entirely unbecoming a duke of 30 years, 3 days before his own wedding, over a woman who believed him to be a servant 3 times his actual age. He had meant to test her character. He had not accounted for the possibility that in doing so, he might lose his own composure so entirely and so quickly. Tomorrow, he told himself, staring at the water-spotted ceiling, tomorrow the true carriage would arrive, and he would deliver her safely to Rothermere Hall, and there, as himself, as the Duke she had been promised to, and dreaded in equal measure, he would have to find some way to undo the small, foolish deception he had begun, before it grew into something neither of them could forgive. He did not yet know how very much harder that undoing would prove than the deceiving had been. Morning came grey and clean-washed, the storm entirely spent, and with it came a fresh carriage from Rothermere Hall, driven, to Lynette's mild surprise, by a younger groom rather than by Godwin, who explained, with a carefully neutral face, that his old bones required a day's rest after the previous night's exertions, and that he would follow on behind at his own pace to deliver a message to the house. "You have been very kind to me, Mr. Godwin," Lynette said, taking his weathered hand in both of hers before she climbed into the waiting carriage, unaware of how the touch made the man beneath the disguise go very still. "I shall not forget it. Whatever awaits me at Rothermere Hall, I am glad to have made your acquaintance first. You have given me more hope for my marriage in one evening's conversation than 6 months of my aunt's assurances ever managed." "The pleasure, Miss Hale," Julian said, in Godwin's rough, aged voice, "was entirely mine. I very much hope, that you will find at Rothermere everything you have wished for and been too wise to ask aloud." She smiled at him then, a real smile, warm and unguarded, the first he had seen from her in their entire acquaintance, and it struck him with a force that left him standing in the inn yard long after her carriage had rolled away down the lane, watching the dust settle with the distinct and troubling sensation of a man who has just made his situation very much worse. Rothermere Hall, when Lynette's carriage finally drew up before it 2 hours later, was every bit as grand as she had feared. A great sweep of pale stone rising against a green Kentish hillside, windows catching the morning light like 100 watching eyes, a household of liveried servants already assembling upon the steps to receive her with the sort of ceremony that made her stomach clench with dread. She was helped down by a footman, shown into a hall so vast her footsteps echoed against marble floors, and left to wait, alone and travel-worn, in a receiving room hung with portraits of Rothermere ancestors who all seemed, to her anxious eye, to be regarding her with the same faint aristocratic disdain. It was there, 20 minutes later, that the Duke of Rothermere came to meet his betrothed for what she believed to be the first time. Lynette heard the door open behind her and turned, composing her face into the careful, neutral pleasantness she had practiced in her aunt's looking-glass for a solid week, and felt every fragment of that composure shatter at once, like glass dropped upon stone. The man who stood in the doorway was perhaps 30 years of age, tall and dark-haired, dressed with the quiet, unshowy elegance of a man who had never needed to prove his consequence to anyone. His face was handsome in a stern, guarded way, all sharp planes and careful control, and his eyes, when they met hers, were a clear, startling grey that she had seen, not 18 hours before, looking out at her from beneath a coachman's weathered brow. "Miss Hale," the Duke of Rothermere said, and his voice, unmistakably, impossibly, was the voice of Godwin, merely younger, merely stripped of the careful roughness he had worn like a second coat. "I understand you have already had rather more of an introduction to my household than I intended." Lynette stood frozen in the center of the receiving room, the blood draining from her face by degrees as understanding crashed over her in a slow, sickening wave. The old coachman's clear grey eyes, his unaccountable eloquence, his intimate knowledge of the Duke's private griefs, spoken with a feeling that had struck her, even at the time, as too raw, too personal, for mere servant's loyalty. "You," she said, and her voice came out smaller than she intended, and far more wounded. That was you, the whole time. Godwin was—" "I owe you an explanation," Julian said, taking a step toward her, his hands raised slightly, as though to forestall a blow he knew he had earned. "And an apology, Miss Hale, though I am aware that neither will undo what I have done." "You let me speak of you," Lynette said, and now something hot and furious was rising beneath the shock, burning away the shame that had first flooded her. "You let me tell you every fear I had of the man I was to marry. You let me pity you, and confide in you, and defend you to an innkeeper who thought you beneath his notice, and the entire time you were laughing at me, weren't you? Watching to see whether the poor debtor's niece would embarrass herself before the great Duke of Rothermere." "I was not laughing," Julian said, and there was something fierce and wounded in his own voice now, something that made Lynette falter despite her anger. "I have never in my life been further from laughter, Miss Hale. I disguised myself because I have been made a fool once already, by a woman who showed the world one face and me another, and I would not, enter another marriage blind to which face I might be given. I meant to observe you for an hour, perhaps 2, and satisfy myself that you were not cruel to those you believed beneath your notice. I did not mean for an axle to break. I did not mean to walk 2 miles beside you in the rain, nor to hear you defend an old man's comfort to an innkeeper with more passion than most great ladies muster for their own husbands, nor to sit by a fire and hear you speak of your fears with more honesty than I have been offered by anyone in 2 years. I did not mean, Miss Hale, to begin admiring you before I had even given you my true name." Lynette stared at him, her chest heaving, caught between the fury of having been deceived and the terrible, treacherous warmth that his words kindled despite everything. "You had no right," she said, more quietly now. "Whatever your reasons, whatever Lady Camilla did to teach you caution, you had no right to test me as though I were a horse you were considering for purchase, to be examined without my knowledge before you committed to the sale." "No," Julian agreed. "I had no right at all, and I am sorrier for it than I know how to say. Sorry does not undo a night of confidences given to a man I believed to be a servant, when in truth He was the very man judging whether I was fit to marry him. You are entirely correct to be angry, Julian said. I would think less of you if you were not. Something in the quiet steadiness of that answer, the total absence of excuse-making, the plain acceptance of her fury as her rightful due, caught Lynette off guard, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the vast receiving room holding its breath around them. I do not know what to do with you, Lynette said at last, and there was, despite everything, the faintest, unwilling curl of something that was not quite laughter in the words. You are either the most calculating man in England or the most foolish, and I cannot for the life of me determine which. Both, I fear, Julian said, and something in his stern face eased very slightly at her tone. Though I hope you will allow me the chance, in the days remaining before our wedding, to prove that I am not entirely without honor, whatever else I have shown myself to be. 3 days, Lynette said. You have 3 days, Your Grace, to convince me that the man I am to marry is worth the trust I so foolishly gave a coachman who did not exist. It was not forgiveness. It was not even close to forgiveness. But it was, Julian thought, watching her sweep past him toward the door with her chin held high and her ruined blue pelisse still faintly damp at the hem, very much more than he had any right to expect, and he found himself, for the first time in 2 long, guarded years, genuinely afraid of losing something before he had even properly gained it. The 3 days that followed were unlike anything Lynette had imagined when she first climbed into her aunt's shabby travelling coach at Bramblewood. She had expected coldness, or at best indifference, a duke too occupied with his estates and his consequence to trouble himself over a bride he had acquired chiefly to settle a debt. Instead, she found herself, almost against her will, in the company of a man who seemed determined to earn, through action rather than apology, some measure of the trust his deception had cost him. He showed her the orangery on the first morning, walking 3 careful paces behind her, rather than beside her, as though he understood that closeness was a privilege he had forfeited and must earn back by degrees. He showed her the library on the same afternoon, a room so vast and so full of books that Lynette, who had grown up in a household where reading matter consisted chiefly of her father's unpaid bills, felt something close to reverence overtake her anger for the length of an hour. He noticed, with an attentiveness that unsettled her more than any grand gesture could have done, that she lingered longest before the shelves of poetry, and the following morning, a slim, beautifully bound volume of verse appeared upon her breakfast tray, with no note attached, and no need for one. You are trying to buy my forgiveness, she told him on the second evening, as they walked together in the Gathens beneath a sky gone the color of a bruise, streaked pink and violet with the setting sun. Books and orangeries and careful silences. Do you imagine that is what I want from you, Your Grace? No, Julian said. I imagine you want honesty, which I gave you a very poor beginning of, and time, which I cannot manufacture no matter how many books I place upon your tray. I am not attempting to buy your forgiveness, Miss Hale. I am attempting to show you, in whatever small ways remain to me, that the man who walked beside you in the rain was not a performance. He was simply me, without the coat, and without the lie of my age, but not without the rest of it. Lynette was quiet for a long moment, watching the last light drain from the sky. Tell me about her, she said finally. Lady Camilla. Godwin told me. You told me, I suppose I must say now, a version of the story. I should like to hear it from the man who lived it, rather than the coachman who witnessed it. And so, walking beside her in the gathering dusk, Julian told her of a young man eager to be loved, of a beautiful woman who had seemed, for a season, to offer exactly that, of the slow, sick unraveling of an illusion he had wanted too badly to see clearly. He told her of the night he had found Camilla's hand raised against a weeping housemaid, and the several endless seconds in which he had stood frozen, understanding all at once that 2 years of courtship had been built upon a foundation of sand. He told her, too, of the version of events Camilla had spread through every drawing-room in London within a fortnight, and of his own stubborn, wounded pride, which had kept him silent rather than dignify her lies with a correction that would only have painted him a jilted fool. "I let the world call me heartless," he said, "because I could not bear to be pitied as a man too blind to see cruelty when it smiled at him. It was easier to be thought cold than to be thought foolish. I see now that it cost me more than my pride. It has cost me 2 years of solitude I did not need to endure, and very nearly cost me the chance to know you honestly, because I trusted my scheme of disguises more than I trusted my own judgment of character. And do you trust it now?" Lynette asked quietly. "Your judgment of my character, I mean." Julian stopped walking and turned to face her fully, the last light catching the sharp, careful planes of his face and softening them, for once, into something unguarded. "I trust it entirely," he said. "I trusted it the moment you asked whether an old coachman was hurt, before you had given a single thought to your own ruined gown. I have not doubted it since, Miss Hale, whatever doubts you have every right to hold of me." It was, Lynette thought, watching him in the fading light, a very dangerous thing to feel her anger softening so quickly into something else entirely, something that felt perilously close to the very hope she had warned herself 3 days ago not to indulge. But dangerous things, she was beginning to learn, did not always announce themselves as such. Sometimes they arrived quietly, in a coachman's kind grey eyes, and by the time one recognized them for what they were, it was already very much too late to turn back. The trouble, when it came, arrived in the shape of Lady Camilla Vexley herself, unannounced and unwelcome, on the 3rd morning before the wedding. Lynette was in the rose garden, cutting flowers for the small country wedding Julian had promised her, modest, he had said, and entirely her own choosing, a promise that had done more to ease her heart than any number of books or apologies, when a shadow fell across the gravel path, and she looked up to find a woman of extraordinary glittering beauty, regarding her with an expression of polished, poisonous amusement. "You must be the little debtor's niece," Lady Camilla said, before Lynette had even risen from her crouch among the roses. "How very charming. Julian does have a talent for finding the most unlikely creatures to rescue his fortunes, doesn't he? First a coal merchant's daughter he nearly ruined himself courting, now a girl whose father could not manage to pay his own tailor." "I do not believe we have been introduced," Lynette said, rising with as much dignity as the rose's thorns and her own racing heart allowed. "No need. I know precisely who you are, and I suspect you have already heard a great deal too much about me, though I doubt you have heard the truth of it, since Julian has never once in 2 years troubled himself to correct the pretty lies I told about him." Camilla's smile was a beautiful, terrible thing, sharp as the rose's thorns. "Has he told you why he really ended our engagement, little Miss Hale? Or has he let you believe some noble story of housemaids and cruelty, when the truth is rather simpler? He could not bear that I saw through his coldness to the frightened boy beneath it, and it wounded his pride so badly that he has been punishing the world for it ever since." "I know the truth," Lynette said, though her voice shook slightly with the effort of holding steady before such calculated venom. "I know what you did to that housemaid, and I know what you have done to his reputation these 2 years since, out of nothing more than wounded vanity." Something flickered across Camilla's beautiful face, surprise, quickly smoothed away. How touching, that he has confided in you so thoroughly, after so short an acquaintance. "Tell me, Miss Hale, has he mentioned that he came to me himself, not 4 months past, and asked whether I might consider renewing our understanding, now that his solicitors had found him such an unpromising match to settle his cousin's debts?" "No, I thought not. Men rarely mention their second choices to the woman they have settled for." It was a lie. Lynette felt it in her bones even as her heart lurched painfully at the words. But it was a lie constructed with a cruel, surgical precision, aimed directly at the softest, most vulnerable part of her. The fear, buried since the very first letter from Julian's solicitor, that she was nothing more to him than a convenient settlement of accounts, chosen not for herself, but for the absence of any better option. "I do not believe you," Lynette said, but her voice wavered, and Camilla's smile widened, sensing the crack she had made. "Believe what you like, but ask him yourself, before you stand up before your little country vicar in 2 days' time, whether he came to Vexley House this spring and begged me to reconsider. Ask him whether he still keeps my portrait miniature in his desk, tucked behind his private correspondence, where a bride might never think to look. Ask him, Miss Hale, and watch his face very carefully when he answers, for I promise you, he is not nearly so honest a man as his coachman's disguise made you believe. She swept away before Lynette could form any answer at all, leaving her alone among the roses with her heart hammering, and her hands, she realized only distantly, trembling around the stems she had cut. Lynette did not go to Julian directly. She told herself it was pride, or caution, or simple exhaustion after the shock of the encounter, but in truth, some small, wounded part of her was afraid of what his face might reveal if she asked him outright, afraid that Camilla's poison might, after all, contain some grain of truth beneath its cruelty. She spent the remainder of the day in a state of careful, brittle politeness, avoiding Julian's company as best she could without provoking questions, and retired early to her chamber with a headache that was only partly invented. It was Julian himself, sensing the change in her the moment she appeared at supper, with her smile too fixed and her eyes too carefully avoiding his own, who finally pressed the matter, following her to the base of the great staircase after the meal with a directness that brooked no evasion. "Something has happened," he said. "You have not looked at me properly since this morning. Tell me what it is, Lynette, I beg you. Whatever it is, I would rather know it plainly than watch you retreat behind politeness for the 2 days remaining before our wedding." It was the first time he had used her Christian name, and something in the unguarded urgency of it broke through her careful defenses more thoroughly than any argument could have done. "Lady Camilla came to the rose garden this morning," she said. "She told me you asked to renew your understanding with her, not 4 months past. She told me you keep her portrait still, hidden in your desk. She told me I am nothing more to you than a convenient settlement, chosen because no better option remained." Julian's face went very still, and for one terrible, suspended moment, Lynette feared she had her answer already in the sudden pallor of his expression. But then something hardened in his grey eyes, something that was not guilt, but a cold, controlled fury she had not yet seen from him. "None of that is true," he said. "Not one word of it, Lynette, and I will prove it to you this very hour, if you will only come with me." He led her, without further explanation, to his study, a room she had not yet entered, book-lined and quietly masculine, lit by the last grey light of the fading day, and crossed directly to the great mahogany desk that dominated it, pulling open the topmost drawer with hands that were not quite steady. "There," he said, gesturing to its contents. "Look for yourself, if you doubt me. There is no portrait of Camilla Vexley in this house, hidden or otherwise. I had every likeness of her burned the night I discovered what she had done to that housemaid, and I have not seen her, nor written to her, nor sought her company in any fashion these 2 years past, until this very morning, apparently, when she took it upon herself to seek out mine, unasked and uninvited, for the sole purpose, I now understand, of poisoning what little trust I have managed to build with you." Lynette stared into the empty drawer, then up at his face, searching it for any trace of the deception Camilla had promised she would find there, and found instead only a raw, wounded earnestness that made her chest ache with something far more complicated than relief. "Why would she lie so elaborately?" Lynette asked slowly, "if she has truly no hold over you at all?" "Because she cannot bear to see me happy with anyone else," Julian said, "least of all a woman she considers beneath her notice, whose very ordinariness exposes the falseness of everything Camilla built her own beauty upon. She would rather see this marriage collapse in suspicion and mistrust than watch me find, in you, the very thing she was never capable of offering me herself." He closed the drawer with a firm final motion and turned to face her fully, his expression stripped of every careful guard he had worn since the moment of his first revelation in the receiving room. "I will not pretend our marriage began under the circumstances either of us would have chosen," he said. "I deceived you, and you have every right to have doubted me again today, given how badly I began. But I will tell you the truth now, plainly, as I ought to have told you from the very first mile of that carriage ride. I do not want you because a solicitor selected you to settle a debt. I want you because you defended an old man's dignity to an innkeeper who saw only his coat. I want you because you spoke honestly of your fears to a stranger you believed had nothing to offer you in return and asked for nothing but to be seen. I want you, Lynette Hale, because in 3 short days you have shown me more genuine goodness than 2 years in London society ever managed to produce, and I would be the greatest fool in England to let Camilla Vexley's jealousy undo what little trust we have only just begun to build. Lynette stood very still in the grey evening light of his study, her heart beating so hard she thought he must surely hear it, and found, to her own considerable astonishment, that every trace of the morning's doubt had burned away entirely, leaving behind something clean and certain and entirely new. "I am angry with you still," she said, "for the disguise and for the deception, and for 3 days of confusion I did not ask for and did not deserve. But I do not believe, not for one moment, that you have lied to me about this." "No," Julian said. "I have not, and I will not. Not now, not ever again, whatever else I have failed to give you honestly from the start." It was not a proposal, not precisely. That formal question had, after all, been settled months before, by solicitors and debts, and the cold arithmetic of her aunt's necessity. But it felt, standing there in the fading light, with his grey eyes fixed on hers, with an intensity that made her breath catch, like something far more binding than any formal offer could have been. A promise made not out of obligation, but out of choice, freely given at last, by a man who had finally learned to trust his own heart over his own pride. The wedding, 2 days later, was smaller and plainer than anyone at Rothermere Hall had expected of a duke's marriage. A country chapel rather than a fashionable London church, a handful of guests rather than the whole of society, flowers cut by the bride's own hand from the rose garden where a jealous woman had once tried, and failed, to poison what was growing there. Mrs. Prudence Yardley attended, stiff and satisfied in her best grey silk, congratulating herself audibly to anyone who would listen upon having arranged so advantageous a match, entirely unaware of how very nearly her niece's happiness had been undone by a lie she had never learned of and would certainly never comprehend. But it was the presence of one particular guest, standing quietly near the back of the small chapel, in a coat considerably finer than any he had worn upon the driving box, that made Lynette's eyes fill with unexpected tears as she walked past him toward the altar. An old man, genuinely old this time, his true white hair and his true stooped shoulders bearing no resemblance at all to the disguise his master had once borrowed, watching the ceremony with an expression of deep and private satisfaction. The real Godwin, it turned out, had been only too delighted to attend the wedding of the young mistress he had never met, but felt, somehow, he already knew a great deal about. "You gave him your name," Lynette whispered to Julian, as they exchanged their vows before the small, attentive crowd, unable to keep the words from slipping free, even in so solemn a moment. "I owe him a debt of gratitude nearly as large as the one I owe you." "He was glad to lend it," Julian murmured back, his grey eyes bright with a warmth that no coachman's disguise could ever have concealed for long, not from a woman as clear-sighted as the one standing beside him now. "Though I confess, my darling, that whatever debt remains between us, I intend to spend the whole of our marriage repaying it, not out of duty, nor obligation, nor any cold arithmetic of solicitors and settlements, but because I have never in my life wanted anything so entirely and so honestly as I want to spend my days earning the trust I so nearly threw away in a rainstorm 3 short weeks ago." Outside the chapel windows, the Kentish sky had cleared to a soft, unclouded blue, and somewhere beyond the churchyard wall, an old coachman, who had once been a duke's disguise, and a duke who had once been an old coachman's borrowed face, stood together, in every sense that mattered, as one, no longer divided by title or deception, no longer separated by pride or fear, but joined at last in the plain, unguarded honesty that had first bloomed between them on a rain-soaked country road, when a frightened girl had thanked a kind old stranger for his trouble, never knowing that the whole of her future had already, quietly, irrevocably, chosen her in return. They did not live, in the years that followed, without ordinary difficulty. No marriage built upon so strange a beginning could ever be entirely without its trials, and there were seasons when old wounds, his and hers alike, rose up to test the trust they had built so carefully in those first uncertain weeks. But Lynette never again doubted, not truly, not for more than the length of a single difficult evening, that the man she had married had chosen her for herself alone, for her stubbornness and her honesty, and the fierce, unthinking kindness that had made her defend an old servant's dignity before she had ever thought to consider her own comfort. And Julian, for his part, kept no portraits hidden in desk drawers, told no careful half-truths to preserve his pride, and never again mistook coldness for strength, nor silence for safety. He had learned, in the space of a single rain-soaked journey, that the truest test of any heart was not what it concealed from the world, but what it was willing, in the end, to reveal. And he had found, in the plain, unadorned honesty of a debtor's niece, who had once thanked an old coachman for his trouble, a love more durable than any title, and infinitely more precious than any debt it had first been meant to settle. It became, in time, a story told quietly among the Rothermere household staff, embellished a little more with each retelling, of how the great Ice Duke had once played coachman to win his own bride's honest heart, and how she, in turn, had thawed 2 years of careful, guarded solitude, with nothing more than a kind word, offered to a stranger she believed had nothing at all to give her back. The real Godwin, when asked, would only smile his slow, knowing smile, and say that he had always believed his master capable of warmth, given half a chance and the right sort of company to draw it out, and that he, for one, had never doubted for a moment how the story would end, from the very hour he had lent his good name to a duke too proud and too frightened to court his own bride honestly from the start. For Lynette, the memory she treasured above all others was not the grand wedding, nor the fine gowns that followed it, nor even the moment of revelation in the receiving room that had so nearly undone everything before it properly began. It was the small, ordinary moment on a rain-drenched country road when she had taken an old man's weathered hand in both of her own and thanked him, quite sincerely, for his trouble, never knowing that the trouble she thanked him for was the very beginning of a love that would carry her, gently and irrevocably, into a life she had once believed herself entirely powerless to choose. She had been promised to a duke she dreaded, sight unseen, by an aunt who cared more for a settled debt than a settled heart. She had ended, instead, married to a man she had come to know first as a servant, then as a friend, and only last of all as a husband. And in that order, she often thought afterward, lay the whole of her good fortune, for she had loved him honestly and completely, long before she had ever learned enough of his title to be dazzled by it. It was, she supposed, watching him across their breakfast table some months later, laughing quietly at some small remark of hers, with the unguarded warmth she now saw so often it had ceased to startle her, precisely the sort of ending her aunt would have called a miracle, and precisely the sort of ending Lynette herself had learned, through hard experience and harder honesty, to call simply this, a love that had been tested, and found, against every expectation, entirely true.